I'm Alisea McLeod, and this is my, well, almost second year at the University of Chicago. I started in December of 2021 already, and I am the program manager for curricular innovation here. And so essentially I work with the MAPS program, and I am the lead on that. So I recruit students into the program, and I also develop the curriculum, and I also support students once they have entered the program. But my initial transition to the University of Chicago was actually in 2020 during the pandemic. I was a Neubauer Fellow. I came here to work with a professor of sociology/history, John Clegg, on Civil War era records related to emancipation. After graduating with my PhD in 1998, I took my first job at St. Augustine's or Augustine's, depending on where you are in the country, how you want to pronounce it, and worked there about 6 years as an assistant professor. My training is actually in critical literacy or rhetoric and composition. And so I was the director of the Writing Center there from 1996, I think it was, through 2001. And then after that, I moved with my family to Indiana, and I worked at Indiana University South Bend, basically in that same capacity. I wasn't a director of writing, however, but certainly a teacher of writing. From roughly 2001 or maybe it was 2002, so we moved late in 2001 to Indiana. So I would say roughly 2002 through 2007, maybe, I don't know, I lose track. Yeah, did lots of interesting things there in the writing program, but also served on the African American Studies Committee, made some really good connections there, and also participated in a sort of youth leadership summer institute, kind of like a bridge program. And then, let's see, I also during that time, same period of time, I got an experience in museum education. So I was a museum educator at the time, the museum at Southwest Michigan College. It's now the Dowagiac Area Museum in Cass County, Michigan. And that was during a period also sort of transition. I wanted to, so I've skipped over somewhere in there fit another position I had. I had returned to my alma mater to be chair of English, and worked my way back. After I worked my way back from there, and I was in transition, I wanted to see what in, I guess, the industry, or I wouldn't exactly say the corporate sector, but I was interested in museum work, maybe even library work. And I don't know if it was by chance or design, I came across this museum education job. I remember reading the ad, and I was like, oh, I do that for free. When I interviewed, I actually said that to the director, I would do that for free. And so I did do it for 2 years, and I learned a great deal, but probably the most important thing that happened in that position was that I learned that Cass County, Michigan was a central and so critical site for the Underground Railroad in Michigan. And so I developed some programming around that, and also became a part of a group of Underground Railroad researchers of specifically Cass County, but also expanded my network to persons who also work on that area of research, who are with the National Network to Freedom or the Underground Railroad. must have gone next to, this is going to be one of those parts you have to edit. Let's see, what was my last job? Oh, yeah, so that's when I went down to Mississippi. After my second stint at IUSB, I took a position at Rust College in Holly Springs, Mississippi, and I stayed there for 9 years. There are days I still think I'm there. From roughly 2011 till the pandemic started, and then I transitioned back to Indiana. And as I said, at that point, that's when I come to the University of Chicago as a Neubauer Fellow. So that's my work experience.
And what was your role at Rust College?
So this is how I transitioned to Rust, thinking I'd be there for 2 years. And honestly, I have always needed to, in fact, find creative ways to fund my research or to get into the archives, essentially. And I had been traveling to Mississippi for many years. In fact, sometimes it was our family vacation. Just to go to the courthouse in Marshall County, Mississippi, or other surrounding counties. And just, on a whim, I was looking at ads in the Chronicle, and I saw an ad for Rust. And I knew that I fit the position and that I would literally be steps away from the courthouse. And so I went down there thinking I'll do that for 2 years, and that turned into 9 years because I went from professor to administrator and ended with chair of the Division of Humanities. And I had a fantastic time. I mean, not only was I chair of humanities, but I also, again, expanding my network, I joined the board of the Mississippi Humanities Council, which I just finished my term this year, actually. I think it was winter of this year. And I also was on the state Audubon board. And both of those memberships took me all around the state of Mississippi. And that's why I said I still sometimes feel like I'm there, because those aren't doors that you just close. So in fact, my last time in Mississippi was back in, I think, March of this year. I was at the state archives doing some work on emancipation.
So do you want to tell me about the projects that you're working on?
Yeah, so essentially, this is the long and the short of it. So I always hear historians, I'm not a university trained historian, that's my phrase for persons who have a degree in history from university. All of my training is in rhetoric and composition, and what I refer to as critical literacy. And so I'm certain that I go about work a little differently, and with having training in English, it's harder for me to ignore stories that I see in the archives that I know the public should hear. And I always hear colleagues who do have their training in history say, don't go down every rabbit hole. That makes no sense to me whatsoever. I go down every rabbit hole. Because for me, the stories that emerge in the archive need to be told and sort of want to be told. The best example I can give of this, there are many good examples, but the best example I can give is how I found the first contraband camp register in 2009. I was at the National Archives, and I won't say that I went there exactly on a whim, because it wasn't entirely a whim. I had learned long before that my family had been fairly large landowners in DeSoto County, Mississippi. Definitely large for African Americans. They had over 1,000 acres, and so for African Americans, that's very large. And so from, 19 something till I went to the archives in 2009, I'd been trying to figure out what the answer was to how they came by the land. And before long, I learned that they had been in a contraband camp. And just as importantly, they were in a camp in the Mississippi Valley. They were, in fact, in Memphis. And so I learned that that area was, we'll just say, under the supervision of a man by the name of John Eaton Jr., who was a Presbyterian minister and really quite radical in terms of his vision for emancipation in the Mississippi Valley. And so the conclusion really is that my family benefited from being at a camp under his supervision. My second great-grandfather, who enlisted in the military, served almost directly under Eaton. And I believe as a result, he was able to transition relatively easily to farming after, I also think during, quite frankly, but after the Civil War. And so when I went to the archives in 2009, I was looking for evidence of the farming, and I've since found it, but it was, in some ways, it was much easier than I thought it was going to be to find it. It's really just in the agricultural census. But I was looking for other kinds of evidence as well. And so I went there looking, as I said, for evidence to support that question. And I ended up finding the first register because after one day of being at the archives, I hadn't found what I was looking for, and I went down a rabbit hole I wasn't supposed to go down. Because one of the archivists there on that day just happened to hand me this booklet that talked about this register of freedmen. And then, I went and found the microfilm, plugged it in, and that's when I saw the names of my second great-grandmother, wife of the second great-grandfather who I referenced a few minutes ago. And so her name was listed there with 4 of her children, their children, and there were 2,132, I think, other African Americans in that same record. And immediately, or certainly on that same trip, I realized that I wasn't going to leave there just with those 5 names, but that I was going to transcribe the whole record. And then some way or somewhere between being there for the week I was there and the long, beautiful train ride back home, I decided to transcribe it and to publish it to the web. In fact, to develop a website. And so that website has been up since 2010, and it's the lastroadtofreedom.org website. And it's been beyond rewarding. All kinds of people have contacted me, people who are just interested, people who have found family members. It also has been a way for me to, again, expand my network to African American genealogists, some of the top African American genealogists. I'm not a certified genealogist. I don't attend their conferences. I would if I had time. And yet I know many of them because of this work. So subsequent to publishing that first camp record, I kept looking for more. In fact, that's not quite true. Let me put it this way. What happened was that I was having conversations while at the archives about contraband camps and was pointed into the direction of several more camp records. And then I just kept publishing them, writing about them. And a lot of that is public writing. In fact, most of that is public writing. I always keep a blog. I don't always, I'm not always able to write every month even. But when I'm able, I try to write something about what I find. And that sometimes will result in somebody writing me and saying, well, they don't say, but they do mean they're not going to take this work on. And so since I'm doing it, they will point me in the direction of yet another contraband camp record. And so register. So I think we're up to, I lose count, I think we're up to 60 something records now. And I know there are many, many more, and I hope to find them and publish them as well. I immediately pivoted to the public because I get frustrated, not angry, but I do get frustrated when I consider that something like the MROF, the Memphis Register of Freedmen, that first contraband camp register, is 1864. And if I go out there to the public today and I ask them, what is a contraband camp? Most people are not going to know. Have you ever heard of, do you know how your ancestors transitioned to freedom? Or have you ever heard of the Freedmen's Bureau records? Or have you, and none of this makes sense to me. In fact, it's slightly criminal in my opinion. Because for me to be able, this is the conclusion I came to back in 2009 after I left the National Archives. I said, for me to be able to buy a plane or train ticket to Washington, D.C. almost on a whim, what I mean by that is no one asked me to go. No one required me to go. I was not required for a job to go. I went because I had a question. I didn't go because I had a publisher, a book publisher. I was trying to get a book out, and I had a book publisher, and this was an unanswered question, and they said, you need to go to the National Archives. I went for none of those reasons. The only reason I will add that was an inspiration, in addition to just wanting to answer the question that I talked about earlier, is that, this is a little weird, but fun, in 1992, probably, I was at the University of Michigan, and it was my birthday, and Alex Haley came, and I went to hear him, and I did not have a copy of Roots, and he hadn't finished Queen, but I had a little book called A Different Kind of Christmas, and he autographed it. But in his talk, and so he wrote my birthday, and that's how I know it was on my birthday. Unfortunately, he talked about trying to finish Queen, and he said it was nearly killing him, and literally a week later he was dead. So anyway, but in his talk, I remembered him saying that he stood in front of the National Archives and he asked himself, can I find Kunta Kinte, or can I find my ancestor here? And I just never forgot that, and that has been inspiration. So however many years later, to find myself at the National Archive, not going there to find my ancestors' names in a contraband camp register, because I didn't know at that time that they even existed. And finding them. I just felt like that was an experience that everyone should have, or everyone who has personal papers in a sense, or some connection, personal connection. And I believe that's practically every American. This is one kind of record, but there are other kinds of records. And it shouldn't take personal investment. I'm sure there are plenty of people who would say, well, that's exactly what it takes. The federal government has no say in that, or no responsibility. No, in my opinion, the federal government does have a responsibility. These are federal records. The nation, Congress, has apologized for slavery in a very non-binding way, with no teeth in it. No, it's been made very clear we're not getting any money out of it. The harm that has been done. And yet you have records in your federal repositories that tell our story. And the system right now is to wait on individual scholars to get a grant so that they have time. And we've already seen that that system does not work in terms of delivering this information. Right now, the system is to wait on individual scholars or more popular writers to land on a topic, write a book, and then get a movie that mistreats most of the information. And with that system intact and continuing to invest in that system, another 100 years will pass. And people's ancestors' names will still be at the National Archives as well as local archives, and they won't ever know that they're there. You know, remember how I was saying when I went to the archives, I didn't go to find those registers. I didn't even know they existed. Imagine now finding my life's work. It's as simple as that. You know, I was speaking to a fellow genealogist who lives in Mississippi, who lives in Holly Springs, right down the street from Rust, and she and I do a lot of work together. And I'm nearing retirement age. She's still working too. She is retirement age, and yet we both were saying yesterday, we'll be doing this work until we can't do it. That's freedom. We're not. No pun intended. We're not slaves to this work because someone's making us do it, but because it's so completely rewarding. So completely rewarding. I did a video many years ago about finding my second great-grandmother's name. And someone asked me, well, why is that important? And I said in a very simple way, I said, because I can call her name now.
What's her name?
Nancy Williams. 25 years ago, I couldn't, when I was at the University of Michigan studying other things, right? You know, somewhat following a straight line, I couldn't have called her name. That's freedom. And I could also speak of it in terms of the way I work as well. Because even though I could not have called her name back then, I did know the name. I also did not know the name of her husband, my second great-grandfather.
Which is?
Daniel Williams. I did know the name of their child, who was my first great-grandfather, Robert Williams. Because what happened... in 1977 or 8, whichever year Roots came out on TV, is that we were children, my siblings and I, and we were watching it with our parents. And I remember we were always at my grandparents'. They lived on the east side of Detroit. We lived on the west side. We were constantly going back and forth, and we were watching Roots. And so without coming together, my siblings and I, we just rushed into the house, I remember, of our grandparents, and we asked them for the names of their parents. And they told us. And I remembered because I cared. And so I did know their names. And so still while at the University of Michigan, in fact, I'm going to give my former advisor a reference. His name is Jay Robinson. He's since passed. But I was taking my last course with him, upper level course in rhetoric, and the last day of class, he invited us to his home and asked us what we wanted to work on. And I said, I really think I want to tell the story of my family. Now, my undergrad was in communications, and I wanted to be a journalist. And I feel today like there is a part of me that practices journalism because I'm always trying to get to what the story is, what's the exciting story. And there are many. So with everything that I'd studied at the University of Michigan, and very much seen all of it kind of impacting what I would end up doing, but that last class, when he asked that question, I just said I want to study my family, because I had a sense, I think, as a journalist, but also just the person I am, that there was a deep story there. I mean, this is true for every family as far as I'm concerned, but I could feel it that there was way more than meets the eye with the Williams family. And so that's what I said to him. And I had no idea what his response was going to be, but his response was, then that's what you should do. That's what you should write about. It's very hard for me to see my family history as disconnected from other people's family history. And I'll give you a more concrete example. So as I said, I go down every rabbit hole and I don't ever follow a straight line. So again, with this paper for Stanford, I'm so happy my daughter is patient with me because I'm a little bit the lead on it. We've been arguing a little bit. Who's getting first author on this paper? But yeah, I'm probably going to end up, it's probably going to be me, but maybe subsequent to this paper, it can be her. So she's been very patient as I've tried to figure out what data exactly we're going to present. Now, keep in mind, over the last 10 plus years, I've been really focused on the contraband camp registers, and my research partner, John Clegg, has focused on the soldiers' records. I don't know whether a journalist or what have you, but I just, sitting at my computer one day, went with my gut. This is very recent, like in the last 2 weeks. I felt I wanted to look at the soldiers' records, in addition to the contraband camp records. And so I started transcribing better than I had done, say, a year or 2 or 3 years ago, my grandfather's unit, which was the 63rd Regiment. It was considered an invalid regiment or a garrison regiment, other ways to describe it, but essentially they were working with John Eden on these camps in Memphis, and mostly in Memphis, but pretty much the Valley. And so busy transcribing those records. And I have been studying those men in those units for so long, I swear they feel like, that's the other thing. I think all barriers just go away. Like, these aren't my family. Those names, I dream practically at this point because I've been studying them for 10 years or more. I published an article in 2015, I think, on involving undergraduates in this work. And yeah, even that work too sort of intensified my deep dive into studying these men in those units. Anyway, so for that reason too, they are my family. But maybe in the last week, again, just going with my gut, I started to think about white families connected to my family. So I didn't say that when I found, this is so important, I'm glad I'm all over the place or else I wouldn't have gotten to this. So the contraband camp register where my ancestors appear is one of the most detailed ones. And it includes their owner. It includes the owner of all of those 2,132 people. With the exception of the babies. There were babies born at camp who have no owner next to their name because they were born free. So anyway, in a sense. So I have known since 2009 that William Hull, Hull, owned my family in 1860. Let's just say in 1860. So as a result of that, I have spent the last 5 plus 6, 7, who knows, years studying and sort of reconstructing a whole clan of white planter class families from Tidewater, Virginia. That work has been totally, and it's ongoing, it's totally gratifying, completely. Because as you learn about them and where they were and what their practices were, you're learning about your own family. So let's start there. Okay, So I know who these families are, and I'm just going to say, let's say there are 8 of them. And to give you an idea, Meriwether Lewis belongs to that clan. Does that name ring a bell for you?
Yeah.
Lewis and Clark, that's Meriwether Lewis. He belongs to that clan. There are many other people whose names are very familiar. So I was sitting there transcribing the 63rd, and then I thought, do I want to present on the 63rd? Or do I want to see if I can find African American soldiers who have these names of these 8 families I'm studying? I'm saying 8, but I haven't counted. It may be 10. I don't know. Somewhere in that ballpark. Because, again, I suspect that if I study these African American soldiers who have these names, they're going to show up where I expect them to show up. They're going to show up where these white planters migrated to in the West. They're starting, for the most part, the ones I'm studying in Virginia, in about 5 different counties, and they're migrating west. So they're coming to Missouri, Tennessee, Mississippi, Kentucky, mostly. Am I forgetting a place? Anyway, that's mostly where they're migrating to. So my gut tells me that that's where these soldiers are going to be found. And how much more information is that for the public? Because the soldier's record tells where they were born and where they enlisted. So we're going to be able to see their movement just based on their own record. But then if we can trace them back to these families, these white planters who migrated, then we're also able to trace them to many other places. And in addition, we're able, so take for instance, one of the names is Buckner. And there are a lot of them that I've transcribed in the last week. We're going to see the Buckners largely in Kentucky, but we're going to see some over in Missouri. And then another connected family is the Herndons. We're going to see a lot of them in Missouri. So we're also able to sort of start putting together, all of them starting out in Virginia. And then after the tobacco economy begins to suffer due to overexploiting the land, they're moving out. And Kentucky becomes one of the first places because it's opened sooner than some of the other areas. So we're going to see some of these families, if not all of them, having a holding in Kentucky. So all of this starts, once we know this, once we have the evidence of it, it starts forming a narrative that we can give the public. It takes a tremendous amount of time because you got to get all the ducks in a row. But it's so worthwhile. The registers. But let me back up to talk about this concept of contraband. Credit is usually given, although I read somewhere a few years back, someone who was disputing this person who's always most directly associated. Benjamin Butler was the commander at Fortress Monroe in the Hampton Roads area of Virginia, and he was approached by, if I recall correctly, 3 men. This is in 1861. I think it was May of 1861. He was approached by 3 men who essentially were fugitives. I mean, some people hate that term, I'm sure, but they were escaping from their master, and which I think was Mallory. I think the last name was Mallory. And they ended up with an audience, if I'm not mistaken, with General Butler. And they had information, that's key, for the Union cause. And in addition, they may have said, because it does become part of the reasoning, we were working on fortifications. So for instance, labor. We were laboring for the Confederacy. And so I'm sure in consulting with others, General Butler who was an attorney by profession, reasoned that to usurp Confederate labor and property, right, human property, would classify said individuals as contraband of war. And immediately, I think, the communications go out, and African Americans seeking sanctuary behind Union lines come to be thought of as contraband. Now, in all of these records that I've been transcribing, most often, this is my English background coming in again, there's almost always an S on contraband. So for instance, if we see a list coming out of anywhere, could be Missouri, most often it's going to say list of contrabands with an S. And we're talking about African Americans who, if you kind of tease it out a little bit more, they are migrating, moving from a site of enslavement into Union lines. Now, where it gets a little tricky is when you get to 1863 and the Emancipation Proclamation frees African Americans who are not in occupied areas. So Memphis, for instance, becomes occupied in June of 1862. And so what is the correct designation for African Americans who are in Memphis in 1862 but are behind Union lines? And so, yeah, that's something that you kind of have to tease out and analyze based on all of those kinds of differences, peculiarities. And certainly, as I said, consider the Emancipation Proclamation, consider enlistment in the Union Army beginning in the spring of 1863 and on and on. But another thing to keep in mind is that African Americans themselves began using that term. And so it's not just a term that whites are applying, officers, etc., to African Americans, but African Americans themselves begin embracing the term for their own purposes. I'm going to write that down because I can see how that's going to help me in my paper. And the way we know this is that if they don't speak directly of themselves as contraband, they certainly talk about the contraband camp in the pension files. In the pension files, I was about to say, especially when it gets to widows' files, and women are having, for the most part, to tell a longer story because they've got to prove they were really the wives of these soldiers whose pension they're trying to get. In many cases, they were married at the contraband camp, and that's when they'll refer to it. They most often don't say Camp Shiloh or Camp Fisk or what have you. They won't give the actual name, but they'll say the contraband camp. So we know that that term has made its way into the language of African Americans pretty quickly. What happens with me is that I'll get a sense, and I've talked about that in my whole conversation, I'll get a sense of what to do next, where to go. You know, people are asking me all the time, how do you find these things? That's how I find these things. I just get a sense of where to go, looking for them, and what may be there, and the possibility, all of that. So it's back to that question of who has collaborated with you, and I very much feel like those who've gone before and left this trail and left their imprint, their residue, are collaborating. And so I do feel called to the work. I know academics don't really speak in those terms, but whether I talk about sitting at the table with my aunt, or, you know, winding up at Russ where I can walk right down the street, all of these things have called me and placed me in the position to be able to do this work. And so I have faith that it'll continue after me. Certainly with people who I've invited and encouraged to come in and do some of the work, but others as well who are in some kind of way in the right position to be able to do it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.